Hello, everybody. A couple of months ago, we did a show with Sarah Val, the Montana based writer, um, talking about what she describes as the untold story of public service and government. She contributed to a new volume edited by Michael Lewis, Who is Government, which has had quite a big impact. And her chapter, she was writing about Pamela Wright of the National Archives, a very important resource based in Washington, D.C. We're continuing on that theme today with my guest, Michael Kimmage. Back in January, he was named as director of the Kennan Institute as part of the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Long-time listeners, viewers of the show might remember that Michael was on the show back in December of 2021, talking about his, at that time, new book, The Abandonment of the West. And perhaps in terms of the continuation of that theme, he was appointed, as I said, at the Kennan Institute in January, and by April, it was shuttered by a certain Donald Trump. Michael has written about the experience and the disaster on lots of fronts of this policy in a new piece in Liberty's Quarterly, We Must Save the Books. Michael is joining us from Washington, D.C. today. Michael, thanks so much for coming back on the show. I'm not sure if you've seen the Lewis volume, Who is Government? The Untold Story of Public Service. But you're based in Washington, D.C. Is everyone reeling from what's been happening over the last few months? Has it caught guys like yourself, Washington insiders, by surprise?
Absolutely. I don't think anybody was prepared for the way in which the government has been rearranged. That's, of course, a very large story that goes beyond foreign policy. I don't think anybody was prepared for the mass firings. I don't think anybody was prepared for the rapid shuttering of institutions like the Wilson Center. And of course, the Wilson Center is only one of several that have been very, very quickly shut down. I think you could maybe go back in retrospect and look at some of the tea leaves of the campaign, Project 2025 and such, and see that there was a bit of a blueprint for this. But I think that people inferred wrongly, of course, that the second Trump term would be a lot like the first Trump term. And in the first Trump term, although Trump had his disagreements with the government and claims about the deep state and his frustrations with the bureaucracy in DC, but in the first term, there was no assault on the institutions. And that, of course, has been the dominant story over the last couple of months, and to Washingtonians, a very shocking one.
How much does it fit in with the thesis you wrote about back in 2021 on the abandonment of the West?
Well, it fits, but that book is not about government institutions, and it's not really about the foreign policy establishment. That book is a meditation on liberty and self-government, and that's the definition of the West that I use in that book. And I think that we still very much have liberty and self-government in this country. So it's not a crisis of that, but at a moment when a great deal is in question, it does seem like the U.S. commitment to the West is one of those things that takes us to questions of NATO, the transatlantic relationship, and that's quite separate from the fate and the destiny of the Wilson Center. But still, a lot of the givens have been weakening over time. That was evident to me already in 2020 when I published that book, and the weakening proceeds apace.
Yeah, you write about the surreal experience you've had at the Wilson Center in your Liberties Quarterly piece. I'm quoting, I began a new job at the Center of International Scholars on January 13th, 2025. The executive order mandating reduction of the Wilson Center to its quote unquote statutory minimum was issued on the evening of March 21st, and on April the 3rd, almost all Wilson Center employees were fired. There's a surreal quality to this, isn't there, Michael? It certainly must have been for you. Brought in to manage the Kennan Center. 3 months later, the whole thing gets shut down.
That's certainly true, yes. Surreal is the right word for it. Of course, the news came in February and March with the rhythm of a nightmare. First, it was USAID. That's a much bigger story than the Wilson Center. That's 10,000 people. I think it's been reduced to 15 at the present moment. That's where it stands. And then you have the U.S. Institute of Peace, which was shut down, a week or so before the Wilson Center was. But the rapidity of it all, the extremism of these shutdowns, that these were not efforts to reform the institutions, which you might imagine with a new administration, these were efforts to simply to shut them down. And also, among the surreal aspects of this moment in American politics, that there was never any explanation given. If you look at the executive orders, the language is incredibly opaque, and there was never really a number to call in terms of getting an explanation from the White House as to why these institutions had to be shut down. There were some public explanations, but those too are very broad. Of course, it was done in the name of government efficiency, since it was the Department of Government Efficiency that carried out these executions, but that would suggest that all of this was a cost-cutting measure. That seems very, very hard to justify in any respect, and yet the real story, whatever it is, was never put before us. So again, as in a nightmare, things are happening to you. There's a certain logic, but you have no idea what that logic is, and that's what made the nightmare especially nightmarish.
Yeah, there's an Eastern or Central East European quality to this. It could have been written, of course, I don't know, by Gogol or Kafka. So
Right.
many variants of this particular nightmare. And on top of that, I mean, the guy who was supposed to be running Doge now has disappeared. So you can't even look for people responsible. They've disappeared like vandals off into the literally vandals. And of course, in terms of the fall of the Roman Empire, the Vandal peoples who destroyed Rome have disappeared into the sunset, and we don't even know who's responsible for any of it.
Yeah, no, that's the texture of it all. There was definitely not. It was not the Department of Government Accountability that did this. It was the Department of Government Efficiency. And as far as I know, there's been no follow up from the people who carried out these decisions as to what their consequences have been. So it was a rapid and, in a way, faceless. I agree with the Gogol Kafka analogies, because those two writers deal with sort of big institutional bureaucratic shifts where things happen to individuals that are far beyond their control, but they happen in a way that's faceless and ultimately without accountability. And one of the things that compounds that is that there's just so much other news, some of it surely more significant than the shuttering of a foreign policy international affairs institute, that's a blip in a way in terms of what's happened mostly in the last couple of months. And yet, had it not been such a crowded, busy period, I think these stories would have been much bigger in stature, and that too contributes to a kind of faceless, almost memoryless quality to these events.
Yeah, I really like in the Liberties piece how you describe it. I'm quoting you. You say after April 3rd, one could still enter the building, of course, being the Wilson Center or the Kennan Center within Wilson, with permission. The abandoned center's library was the first American ruin I have seen. It was the first modern American ruin. What do you mean by the idea of an American ruin, Michael?
Well, I mean, we have such things. I mean, if you go out west, you can see the ruins of Native American cities and communities and such. I mean, you can find a few abandoned buildings in the Washington area, and New England has some of that stuff. But on balance, I mean, compared to Europe, which is full of spectacular ruins, one thinks of the center of Rome or of Athens, which have these very beautiful and also very evocative ancient cities that exist now as ruins in the modern city. That's a feature of European life, and it's much, many poems. Wordsworth has a great poem, Tintern Abbey, about a ruin in Britain, and lots of great paintings about ruins. So it's a common enough feature of, you could say, human experience, and not unknown in the United States. But it's such a modern country, never been defeated in a war, it doesn't have the kinds of experiences that would contribute to ruins. It is especially shocking in the center of Washington, a thriving metropolis, capital city, a city awash in military power, it's shocking to see that you could have a ruin on Pennsylvania Avenue, no less a stone's throw from the National Mall. And by ruin, I mean an abandoned site. And it's not as if the building fell apart; it was still there. But in particular, the library became an abandoned place, and it didn't have the people to tend to it or kind of look after it. Or that was true for a while, and then that became less true. And so it had the aura and the atmosphere of a ruin. And so to see that not only in the United States, but to see it in the very center of its capital city was extraordinary.
You note that America had been defeated in a war. I'm not sure everyone would necessarily agree with that. There was, of course, Vietnam, the retreat from Afghanistan under Biden, even Iraq is certainly not considered by many to be a particularly successful war. Is there an element of kind of celestial justice here, Michael, that the pigeons, so to speak, have come home to roost?
I don't know. It seems to me more random and senseless than that. And of course, you're right that the U.S. has experienced many military defeats in its history. But what I had in mind is that there was never, apart from the War of 1812, which is not a defeat for the United States in the end, but in the War of 1812, the British troops did go through Washington and they burnt down the White House and did make it into the capital city. And of course, the Confederacy and Gettysburg came close to entering into Washington, D.C., although they never made it. But you don't have the experience that, say, Berlin had in 1945 of enemy armies coming in and sort of bombing the city, destroying it, and leaving the city a ruin. After which it was rebuilt. That's just to me alien to the experience so far of Washington D.C. I wouldn't say that it's poetic justice. It doesn't feel symmetrical in that way. And also, whoever is responsible, let's just take Iraq and Afghanistan as our examples, whoever is responsible for those defeats, um, they were quite far from the Wilson Center. And it's not as if the Wilson Center itself was a kind of site of imperial hubris or overreach. But yes, perhaps one could grant you a degree of correctness in the point if we want to speak about the American foreign policy establishment. It is on balance true that this establishment has made a lot of mistakes over the past couple of years, and maybe there hasn't been that much accountability. So the rendering of the Wilson Center Library as a ruin, I guess we could say, in some very extended and indirect way, is a turn of events that could be interpreted as poetic justice.
Yeah, I'm surprised actually that the Wilson Center wasn't forced to change its name in previous administrations, and Trump, of course, would have had some strong feelings on that. You describe the Wilson Center becoming a tomb. So it's a ruin and a tomb. But ruins are places which are falling to pieces. Tombs are places where there's something buried. But what's buried in the Wilson Center?
Mm. Well, what was buried, and of course, in a way, I'm going out of my way in that piece to put things in somewhat poetic terms. You could look at it more prosaically and say that this is something that does happen in governments. There's a new agency coming in, and so the effects of one agency will be cleaned out and the space will be made available to the new agency. And that's technically speaking what was happened. But the thing is that the shutdown was so rapid that there really wasn't time for the people who worked at the Wilson Center to get stuff out adequately, that there was just a great deal of material, posters, books, papers, etc., kind of strewn about the building. And so the tomb-like quality of it was that you had an institution of 150 people that was a hive of activity when it was up and running, with all kinds of people coming through, and a kind of vibrant, dynamic place. And that changed overnight, obviously, when everyone was fired. And so a silence came over the place that was tomb-like, but it was also ruin-like in the sense that it wasn't just empty, but there were kind of random objects and materials that were there throughout the building. A little bit like, and again, this is exaggerating somewhat, but it's a little bit like you would imagine at the moment a war is declared or a great natural disaster and people just run away. And that's why Pompeii comes up in my
and I was thinking
essay.
Pompeii. I know you brought up Pompeii. Future generations, of course, after Pompeii have had much to study because the experience was because of the dramatic volcanic eruption, a lot of the death, the tomb-like or the ruinous nature of Pompeii was captured in a few hundred years when, if there are still historians looking back at what happened in the early 2020s or in 2024, 2025, what do you think how will they interpret these ruins, this tomb?
Well, by a few months from now, this will be a hive of activity of a different kind. It will be a government agency that will be there, and it won't be tomb-like at all. So it's not a historical site by any means that's going to have the permanence of a Pompeii or of an actual ruin. But I can't help but imagine that historians will be, as they often are, baffled by the historical record. A country at peacetime, a country that has enormous affluence, a country that, historically speaking, yes, has its anti intellectual tendencies, but has been quite respectful to expertise, at least for the last 120, 130 years. It's sort of been the reign of the experts in American life in many domains, and then a very, sort of abrupt turning away from that. And of course, you could have conversations about the Center for Disease Control or National Institute of Health, where similar traumas have been inflicted, but the very abrupt turning away from expertise, the sense that learning itself is perhaps extraneous to the activities of the US government. It's never as if this impulse was entirely absent. We could go back to McCarthyism, which is also an assault on expertise and a comparable moment of trauma for the federal government and for the people who worked in it. But this seems sort of larger and more dramatic in scope, and so you do have moments. It's not unknown from the historical record of governments that turn in upon themselves or find themselves in some sense at war with themselves. But again, it's not as if you have a lot of precedents for this in U.S. history, and so I think it will feel a bit as if it comes out of nowhere. And of course, future historians will have the benefit of knowing what the consequences of all this are. Maybe it will be an episode, and some of these structures of expertise will be reconstructed, or maybe this will be a moment of real separation between policymaking and expertise. And I suppose it's the bias of the expert, but it seems to me like the consequences of this will be quite dark and quite painful.
Yeah, and of course, the Romans are obsessed with auguries. I'm not sure. I'm sure they interpreted the volcanic eruption as a kind of augury, but no one can control nature. Whereas
Mhm.
this augury is slightly different. You had an interesting piece, Michael, in Foreign Affairs in the March-April issue about the world that Trump wants. And and we've done a lot of shows on this, that rather than a return to the 19th century, it's a return to the 1950s. You mentioned McCarthyism. Are there very direct connections between what's happening now in 2025 and the 1950s in America?
There are, but they're a little bit opaque. So there's, of course, one direct biographical connection, which is that one of the key aides to Joseph McCarthy was a man by the name of Roy Cohn,
Hmm.
who's the great mentor to Donald Trump, not in recent years, but when he's on the rise.
Did you see
And
the movie The Apprentice?
Mhm. I did, yeah. No, and
Which was a wonderful portrayal of, I don't know if wonderful is the right word, chilling portrayal of Cohn and his relationship with Trump. I mean, it suggested that Trump really only became Trump after Cohn. So in a sense, Trump is really Cohn 2.0.
Precisely, no. So they're the arts of political warfare that Roy Cohn developed for himself and then passed along in some form to the young Donald Trump. And so that's a linkage between the 1950s or between McCarthyism and the current moment. But what I think makes it complicated is that you have a kind of marginal American conservatism in the 1950s. It's, 50s is the Eisenhower era, so you have a Republican in the White House, but a very moderate Republican, one who was very inclined toward bipartisan action. But on the margins of American politics, you have this emerging conservative movement, and it's a conservative movement that is often quite skeptical of the outside world. It's a conservative movement that has a strong polarizing view where the kind of core enemy is almost more the American liberal than the Soviet Union. And it's an American conservatism that is imbued. I mean, conservatism is often this, but it was strongly so in the 1950s, imbued with this sense of loss, that the New Deal, modern times were depriving America of its true soul. So in all of those regards, you do have a kind of foundation for Trumpian conservatism in the 1950s, the skepticism about the outside world, the highly polarized nature of Trumpism, especially in the second term, again, the kind of war on liberals, quote unquote, or perceived liberals, and then finally this strong sense of loss, make America great again. We're about to lose our country. If you don't vote for me, that's it. The country will somehow slip between your fingers. In all of those ways, you do have ties and linkages. But McCarthyism, as a particular phenomenon, is much smaller in a way than Trumpism, because McCarthy was Joseph McCarthy was merely a senator. And now, of course, you have not quite a McCarthyite figure. I don't think that that's the right way of looking at Trump, but you have a figure with strong, almost radical convictions, who's not a senator, but the president.
Yeah, when we look back at the McCarthy period, historians, I think, the consensus is that the victims of that period were people who lost their jobs, people who were persecuted, hounded. Some people left the country. Some people committed suicide. It ruined many people's lives and careers. There's some truth to that now. I mean, there have been lots of pieces, Michael, about people who have lost their jobs in Washington, D.C., out of work, their commitment to public service being undermined, and a degree of tragedy there. But in your Liberties piece, you don't deny that, but you focus on saving the books rather than the people. Why did you take that angle in the piece?
That's a great question. Of course, the people, in a certain way, matter more, but that story has been written, as you're suggesting, the story of what's
many
happening
times and will continue to be. I'm not suggesting that you don't care about the people, but you've taken a different focus.
And it's very good that it be written, and I think it's also being received. It's also the case that in my particular set of responsibilities at this moment, of course, there were people I was working with, and we were responsible for each other, but the library and the books did fall within my direct sphere of responsibility, because the Kennedy Institute has 13,000 books, or perhaps a few more, many of them precious books, that were a part of the Wilson Center library. So it just was a very direct concern. And also, I will say, maybe because I am a historian and have read about McCarthyism, I did my dissertation on American politics in the 1940s and 50s, so it's familiar to me. The vicissitudes of government as it concerns personnel and institutions and people is familiar to me. I am not familiar from the 1950s or any decade of American politics, maybe with the exception of the Civil War, of a moment where a big library could just be left in an abandoned state like this. And so it was just utterly shocking to me, and utterly shocking to me that this is all one entity in a way. It's the U.S. government, and that the Department of Government Efficiency would come with the mission and mandate that they had, still unclear to me, and that it was of no interest to them that there is a book collection, that it's a library, and that if there aren't people to tend to it in some way, that the library is going to be in danger. So I'm still shocked by that, and I wanted to write a piece that really did concentrate on the books. But of course, the title of the piece is "We Must Save the Books." So the "we" is there are people there, but in this case, it's not employees. It's really, in a way, the "we" that I have in mind is all American citizens. Are we going to be caretakers and guardians of these things or not? And that's a question that I'm sure we'll be facing in ways that far exceed the story of the Wilson Center.
Yeah, we mentioned Gogol and Kafka, of course. He's often brought up in this context, but perhaps the writer who would be most at home with your narrative would be Borges, who, of course,
Absolutely.
was both dystopian and satirical, and also a librarian.
No, that's wonderful, and um, I know too little of his biography in Argentina to be able to say whether he lived through political twists and turns that were perhaps similar. I suspect that there might be something there, but in Borges, the books appear, they disappear. They're visible, they're invisible, they're phantasmagoric, and they're also uh, very real. And he sees, I think, much of life as a kind of library, and so the library then for him is a symbol, I suppose, or a metaphor, and it's a wonderful linkage to take his literature into this conversation, and his sort of melancholic mode that's often there in the fiction is also relevant or salient for us at the moment. That's a beautiful connection.
People should, if they haven't read it, read Borges, still one of the great 20th century writers. So you ask in the piece, so what would happen to the books? There are these 10,000. So we're talking about 10,000 volumes just in the Kennan Library or in the Wilson Center altogether?
No, the Wilson Center Library is 30,000 volumes. Ken is probably around 13,000 of those volumes.
So what is the current, where are and what's the state of these books in late May 2025? And has anyone decided what should happen to them?
Yeah, no, it's not such a tragedy, and I do mention in the piece that the books were rescued, and that's certainly true for the Kennan Institute books. They're in a storage site off campus, out of the building, and there have been many wonderful people and institutions who have offered to come and to bring the books to some university libraries, some local libraries, getting them to places where the books will be read, which is the most important thing. And so the books were not destroyed; they were not damaged; they were not put to waste. They've found new homes in most cases, and that's very much as it should be. So one could tell the story. Maybe this is sort of Borgesian as well, in the way that his narratives can kind of split and divide. But you can tell the story as a tragedy, which I think in part it is a very, very unnecessary act of violence within the body politic and to the body politic. But you can also tell the story as one of charity and people helping out and caring about the books. And there was nobody that I talked to when uh, the fate of the books was in question. There was nobody that I talked to who didn't immediately care about what was going to happen to the books, and that was really nice to.
Probably
That
in
was
some ways, sadly, they care more about the books than the people. I'm sure that the people who lost their jobs are struggling to find work, probably in more precarious positions than the books themselves.
that's all very true, and no, I think people did care about the people. I don't know what it is about the books that had a certain kind of vividness,
Books,
or
maybe, Michael, they bring out the best in us. I wonder whether the death of the Wilson Center or the current death is a reflection of the death of a kind of public ideal of public space. I mean, universities themselves, of course, all the headlines these days are about Trump's attack on Harvard, but it's a bigger attack on the independence of universities and perhaps making them more and more privatized and for profit. Is there an element here of that, if there again is a symbol, a symbolic quality to this, a metaphorical quality, the death of a kind of public ideal, a public promise, 20th century one?
well, that may be true in some broader sense. I mean, the Wilson Center, and I always loved the place and had been a part of its activities for many, many years before joining as the director of the Kennan Institute. But I can't say that the Wilson Center was the most public of institutions. I don't think that somebody from the public could have gone in and used the library. I think you would have had to have been a fellow there. And so there was a layer of distance between the Wilson Center and the public. It did have a lot of public events and thought of itself as a public facing institution, but it was not the same as a public library, as the Library of Congress or those things. So the loss that it represents is not quite the loss of learning in public. It's in part that, but that's not really, I think, the lifeblood of the story. I think the lifeblood of the story is a U.S. government. Let's just limit ourselves to foreign policy that recognized the Wilson Center has its origins in the 1970s, that the world is a big, complicated place, that it's essential that people study this big, complicated world in careful, rigorous, nonpartisan ways. And that's also in the process of doing that they invite, with the name of the Wilson Center, as the Center for International, or Wilson International Center for Scholars. Now I'm forgetting whether it's International Center or International Scholars, but the word international was in the name of the institute, the name of the center. And so I think it was a twofold mission that evolved over time for the Wilson Center. It was learning that was to be of use for the government, for decision making, for the policy process, but it was also the construction of goodwill through fellowships and engagement with the outside world. Now, take this back to the 1970s, and this is a Cold War project to be sure. It's about prosecuting and gaining advantage in the Cold War. It's not a completely innocent set of motivations, although I think it was a noble set of motivations. And it's really the loss of that we're living through at the present moment. The notion that learning, especially nonpartisan learning, is of essential value to the policy process. And so you need to invest in institutions like this. That's clearly not the spirit of the Trump administration, but also this construction of goodwill through institutions like this, at a time when, the US is putting the transatlantic relationship into question, speaking with apparent sincerity about the annexation of Greenland, about Canada as the 51st state, uh, you know, having these very, very conflictual meetings in the Oval Office where President Trump is treating guests, visitors to the United States in a very disrespectful manner. It's not the construction of goodwill, it's in some respects the destruction of international goodwill that you see at the present moment. So it's not the loss of the public per se. It's something I think a little bit more precise than that, and it will be very difficult to get it back. It's not impossible. You can conceive of a period a few years from now where we start to reconstruct these institutions, but it's hard. It took about 30, 40 years for the Wilson Center to become the Wilson Center, so it's not like you can snap your fingers and get it back again.
You end on a very dark note. You talk about an abyss. You talk about without these libraries, an abyss opens. Without them, the abyss is kept at bay. We must save the books. What is the abyss? I mean, when you think of abysses, they're dramatically dark places where you fall into. What are we falling into, Michael?
Right. Well, let's take the reference to a tomb back, as we've talked about earlier in this conversation, but it's there in the piece. You could take the abyss as having, multiple meanings. One of them is almost literal. If you don't have librarians to keep a library functioning, it doesn't really matter that you have the books there physically in a place. You're not going to have, access to them. They're not going to be living books in a sense. And so you remove librarians. Let's conceive, God forbid, that the librarians get removed from the Library of Congress. In a way, it will become the place itself will become a tomb-like abyss. The books would stay there. The building doesn't have to be destroyed, but they would become inaccessible. So that's one of the meanings of abyss in this context. Another meaning is that you take a kind of cultural inheritance, and that's what the Wilson Center was, among other things. It was a policy-oriented institution, but it was also a kind of cultural treasure, right? The books were a part of it. The people were certainly a part of it. The fellows who came, the conversations, all of that was something that amounted to a treasure. And you destroy that for no real reason in a matter of days, seemingly in a matter of minutes, and you put nothing in its place. I mean, there too, it's a kind of void or vacancy. That's an abyss. But I think there's another, a sort of third meaning to abyss that you can take from this moment, which is that if you don't care about learning, and if you don't care about nonpartisan discussion of international affairs and how the US is succeeding and failing, as it always does, it's always those two things happening simultaneously. And you need a serious kind of conversation about what's working and what's not working. If you destroy that, and you don't need a Wilson Center for that, but that was a small part of this enterprise in the US government about a careful, considered conversation about foreign policy and international affairs. Well, there too, you create a kind of abyss. So then what is your foreign policy going to consist of? Instinct, gut reactions, quick gestures, of the moment activities with no scope and no process built in for thinking about error, mistake, getting things wrong, there too, I think in a kind of abyss beckons. So it's metaphoric. It's building out from an event that in the end was of relatively small scale, the 150 employees at the Wilson Center, but it's building out from that to what it could mean if this spirit of destruction were to spread in a very big way.
Yeah, in your piece, the foreign affairs piece, The World Trump Wants, you talk about this new clash of civilizations. You write about how Trump is no different really from Putin, Xi, Modi, or Erdogan. Some people might, listening to this, Michael, might think, well, what's happening is simply more truthfulness. America was always like this, even calling it the Wilson Center. Wilson, of course, being certainly all sorts of questions about his attitude to the South and race, his quote unquote Versailles catastrophe certainly contributed to the rise of fascism in Europe in the Second World War. America has always, some people might argue, America has always presented itself as uniquely moral with a special calling. But in fact, it's no different from any other great power. So what's happening now is less surreal and more actually honest. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it's a bracing way of putting things that sort of Trump has removed the veil, and you see that the driving powers and forces in the United States are the profit motive and power projection, and all of that. At times I find myself admiring of Trump's candor, that he has so many modes of speaking and they change by the hour and by the day. But there are times when he takes the U.S. off the pedestal that you're describing, and sort of presents it as a country among other countries. I mean, I think the United States is in many ways a very normal country, and has the kind of the flaws and the possibilities that many other countries have. That I think is legitimate. But still, I'm skeptical to put things in those terms because it feels to me a little uh, nihilistic. It seems to me that every country, we could include the countries that I write about in that foreign affairs piece, Turkey, Russia, China, India, the United States, all of these countries are kind of wrestling between their better and worse selves. And Woodrow Wilson is a great example of that, sort of after Thomas Jefferson, right? Thomas Jefferson, the founder of the Library of Congress and creator of the University of Virginia and author of the Declaration of Independence and Secretary of State, President, et cetera, and many dark sides, as we all know, as to not only slavery as a part of his plantation, but also as a part of his personal life. And Woodrow Wilson segregates the federal workforce and is a dyed-in-the-wool racist. That's absolutely true. But Wilson also has this extraordinary imagination for American foreign policy, and sort of creates modern American foreign policy. And the train station in the city of Prague is named after Woodrow Wilson because of his great contributions to post-World War I Europe. So it's the tension that matters. It's the back and forth. It's a country that is, United States, often in conflict and in tension with itself. And it just feels to me that if we would let the destruction of the Wilson Center pass unnoticed, unremarked, and if we wouldn't think through what it means, that we are caving in some ways to the darker parts of the American story. But it's a back and forth. It's a dialectic, and Trump. Not everything Trump does is bad. Not everything Trump does is wrong. He is a part of that dialectic as well. But it's not all light and it's not all dark. We have to, we have to come to grips with how checkered it all is. I'm very comfortable with that mode of looking at the U.S. and its politics and its foreign policy. But what's been happening to these institutions, U.S. Institute of Peace, USAID, Wilson Center, and others over the course of the last 3 months, it's scandalous, it's wrong, it's destructive, and it has to be thought through very carefully so that we can create limits to this zeal for destruction.
Well, finally, Michael, you write in your foreign affairs piece about it being Biden, not Trump, who represented a detour in American foreign policy. I don't want to turn this into another conversation on Biden, who clearly failed on many levels. What's the alternative to Trumpism and this attack on government and on expertise and on institutions and establishments? in the late 2020s? What would you like to see? We can't go back to Joe Biden, for better or
Right. No,
worse.
I mean, it has to be a two-level alternative, and whether it's a Republican or a Democrat who wins in 2028, a president who has a basic respect for these institutions, sees the value in them, sees their purpose, is able to communicate that, and then to follow through practically on the kinds of things that you need to run them. All of that, I think, is essential. That's the obvious answer to your question in a way, but there's a less direct, less obvious answer, which is something that hits closer to home for people like myself, which is that people who are in these institutions, were in these institutions, would like once again to be in these institutions, must do a much better job justifying and explaining what they do.
The
To
experts, Michael, that Trump
right.
and his people seem to have such contempt for.
Well, but they must do a much better job explaining what they do to the American electorate and to the general population. If the population feels that these institutions are elitist and out of touch and misguided and unnecessary, then it doesn't matter how much somebody like I values them. It's not going to work. And I don't think that there was much emphasis put on that before 2024. I don't think there was sufficient outreach. I don't think that there was enough engagement with the wider society, and there wasn't enough engagement across the political spectrum. So it's by no means a story that is only a story about Trump. It's a much bigger story, and those people who believe in expertise need to find persuasive ways of justifying it in the public sphere. And so that's one of the many ways in which the foreign policy establishment, among other establishments in American life, has its work cut out for it.
Well, this is a story that is going to run and run. The reinvention of expertise, digging it out from the tomb, from the cemetery. Michael, you're a keen observer from Washington, D.C. We'll have to get you back on the show and see how this story unfolds over the next year or two. Thank you so much.
Would be